Hello, my name is Alan Richardson. Welcome to this video. We're going to speak to Kerry McKeever, who has created a Cypress, what would you call it, an extension, a plugin for AG Grid to help automate AG Grid. We're just going to discuss what it does, how it works, and we'll see how far we go. So hello, Kerry.
Hey there, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. So this is going to be your show. So because you're the one that's created this thing. So what is it? What is this thing that you have created?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's you can think of it as an extension, but in Cypress terms, it's a plugin that kind of extends the functionality of Cypress around AG Grid itself. So it uses Cypress's API, but then allows for gathering and manipulation of AG Grid data. Right now, we'll go into the kind of the specifics of what that does exactly, but a lot of it is being able to interact with AG Grid in a way where we can validate our implementation of it in our application.
Cool. And this is exercising it from the outside, so it would work on the end-to-end system, the deployed system.
Yes, actually, it could do either or. So with Cypress, it's really interesting because it works from within the application. So it's internally. So we can do it while we're building our application as well. We don't have to wait to deploy it to an environment. So it's really something that's beneficial for people that are developing and integrating AG Grid into their application, because then they can test in tandem with the development efforts.
Right. Cool. So have you got your screen ready to go? Do you want to show it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the easiest way for people to understand this and see it is to see it in action. And this is all open source. It's all on GitHub. People can use this.
It's open source, completely free, all on GitHub, and anybody is welcome to extend it. So you're welcome to go. And what I'll do is I'll show where it is on GitHub. So it's not exactly easily Googleable, which is just so funny because there's not a lot with Cypress and AG Grid. But I'll share the link here so that people know exactly where to find this. All right. So yeah, first and foremost, here's where the Cypress plugin lives. It's open source, like we had discussed before. It's completely free and available to anybody that's using Cypress and wants to extend it themselves. Are welcome to do so. Here we have pretty comprehensive documentation on how to walk through it and use it. All different types of use cases that you could want with its current functionality. And if you scroll down, we also have some limitations in place. Ideally, what I would like to do is build this out and extend it a little bit further to remove some of those limitations. But AG Grid is just very dynamic, and there's so much that you can do with it. And really, this plugin initially was just for a very limited purpose of gathering the data from the grid, validating the data, maybe doing a little bit of grid manipulation. But there's so much more that can be done here. So I fully welcome.
That's the thing about building automation, isn't it? You build it for your specific needs. So you've used this at work. You build it for what you're trying to do with it at work.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing, I do touch on this a little bit, it's that my intention here is not to do the full automation of a third-party plugin, such as AG Grid. It's more or less just to enable my efforts to automate against it and validate our actual implementation of it. So that's why you won't see everything covered in here, all the different bits and pieces that you can do with AG Grid for your implementation. So it's really just use it to your own discretion and make sure that you're not trying to automate so much of AG Grid as you are automating your code with AG Grid.
That's a good point. I think you cover it in the blog post. What I'll do is when we release this video, I'll stick links to your blog post and things, because you do describe in your blog post the limitations in scope that we have to apply when we are automating someone else's work, because we don't want to have to go down the rabbit hole of automating all of AG Grid. You just want to automate the parts that help you move forward with your application, so that you know that your application is working.
Absolutely, because you can absolutely fall down that rabbit hole and you find yourself just automating every use case. And that doesn't really provide as much value as one might think. You really just want to automate as much as you need to understand that your application is in a good state. You can release with confidence. And that's what I'm hoping that this plugin can help people do.
Yep. And the benefit is you can read the code, so people can extend it. And I've read the code, and I'm not a great JavaScript programmer, but I can understand most of it. So That's a good point. So hopefully we'll get to look at the code as well, and we'll see how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll check, and I'll also, I've been playing around with extending it a little bit as well, and I can talk about some of my personal roadmap that I have for this. But what I could do is I won't scroll through the documentation too extensively. I just want to be known that we do have the documentation available. I can jump right into the code and kind of show you what the tests look like.
Well, how about we run it and let's see it in action? Let's show something really exciting.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, so here I have Cypress already loaded. We just have our one spec here, which is just going to contain all of our smoke tests for this. So if you're extending this plugin, or if you're doing any kind of adding a PR to the GitHub, then this is what you would run and what would be run in the GitHub Actions to make sure that everything is functioning properly. But it goes through pretty much everything that you need and all of the functionality that this plugin has at this moment. And it runs pretty quickly, so it's fairly lightweight.
And this is, so Cypress then is loading itself and the app into the browser at the same time.
Exactly. Yes. So unlike Selenium, which is a browser automation tool, this is more of an automation tool that exists within the application. So you can leverage your actual, if you're working within JavaScript libraries like Angular, React, Vue, what have you, you can hook into the code that's within them and do some manipulation with your tests, which I actually do for the purpose of AG grid validation. In that same note, one thing that I do is, this is a very small table. We have 4 columns here. We don't have a lot of rows. I think we have, 5 rows here? But there is pagination. And why I bring that up is because, in the real world, especially if you're dealing with a ton of data, maybe you'll have 20 rows, or not 20 rows, but 20 columns. Maybe you'll have infinite number of rows. And the way that AG Grid loads up its data is in the DOM. If you're looking at how it's loaded up, all that you'll notice that is available to gather from that table is whatever's within the viewport. And that can be troublesome when you're automating your tests, because if your test cannot gather all of that data, you're not doing a full validation. So one of the things that I do is I go in and in the application, I'll dig into some of these tests that ran here, but just to kind of pivot a bit and show what I'm doing. I'm going to go into the app in our grid specifically. And you'll notice down here, I'm doing a check with the AG grid when we load it up with our data and we're about to, present it. I'm checking the window object to see if Cypress is running. And what this is saying is, all right, if Cypress is running, I want you to squish all of those columns into the viewport so I have them all available. So none are hanging off the screen and not visible within the DOM. And this helps me. It doesn't look pretty, it's not really the way that it's going to be presented to the end user, but for data validation and verification purposes, it works exactly how I need it to. And it's a good way to check, is this being run by automation, and what do I need to do to make sure that my application is in a state that allows me to do the validation that's required, to check all the boxes and say, all right, we're good here.
And is that what you do in the real world, or not just in your test example?
I do, yes. So it really depends also on your implementation of AG Grid. So if you have a pretty standard implementation and your grid is rendered at the time of, so I work within Angular primarily, and if your grid is rendered at the time of the components, the constructor gets called, what you can do is you can have just this little block of code in there, and it will do exactly what I was saying, which is just squish everything in really tightly and let you get all that data from the DOM. However, there are some implementations where maybe you're doing a little more massaging of the data, or maybe the grid is not fully loaded at the time of the constructor being called within that component, for example. Then it's not quite as straightforward. I'm not 100% sure what goes on behind the scenes of size columns to fit. I know it does some mathematical equation to make sure at a very high level, and I might be speaking a little bit ignorantly here, but I know it does some mathematical equations to see what size the grid is and how to squish everything in, which does not work 100% of the time. I would say maybe 80 to 90% of the time. But in those instances, there are ways that there's ways around it. For instance, currently in an application that I'm working on, this does not quite work the way I expect it to. But during the execution of the test, I can manipulate the viewport. So I just set it to a very wide viewport, so all of my columns are visible and accessible, and it works just as good. And then right after I validate or grab that data, I set the viewport back to the original size. It's not preferable, but you can work around.
And Cypress can run headlessly as well as in that GUI format.
Absolutely. Yep.
So should we have a quick look at what the test looks like in Cypress?
Absolutely. So what I can do is, let's start with the very first one. It's a little bit more of a complicated scenario where we're validating paginated data. And one of the cool things about Cypress is if you open up the runner, what you can do is see how it was doing its execution and validation in real time. So as I scroll over the log here, you'll see certain items change or get highlighted. You see that we're clicking on the next button for the paginated grid, and we're scrolling through, and we're doing this validation here as well, which will be shown as a green assert block in the log.
And that's saying DOM snapshot. Is that an actual DOM snapshot that it's rendering in the browser? This isn't a screenshot we're seeing. This is an actual saved DOM.
Absolutely. So one of the cool things here is I'm going to go ahead and click on this. Say we had a failure, or maybe I want to do an additional, check here to say, all right, this is array 5 to deeply equal array 5. Okay, it doesn't really give me much detail, so I want to make a double check and make sure that what it's asserting is exactly what I need to. So all I would do is open up our DevTools and go to the console, and I can look at the one-to-one array comparison here to make sure that, all right, this is exactly what I'm expecting it to be. We have this array deeply equals this one exactly.
Right. That's pretty cool, because I've just been using the React testing library, and one of the limitations I was having was when I was trying to debug tests that were not working well. So Cypress is clearly really supporting that use case.
It is. It's been very helpful. I've worked with Selenium for a large part of my career, and Selenium, it gathers screenshots. You can do screen recording if you enable it, and you have your logs. But this makes it so much easier to debug. In my experience, it makes it easier to debug. Say you have an issue with an element in your DOM. I can go ahead and click on this guy, and it gives me that element right here. So I can look at this and say, okay, is this the element that I'm looking for? Or maybe my selector I'm using is incorrect, or it's bringing back more than one element, because it shows me, exactly how many elements are given back with the selector I used. So in my opinion, I think it just allows for faster and easier automation.
That's cool.
Yeah. And so that's essentially what this test is doing. It's going through, and I have some, let me pull up the test in Cypress itself so you can kind of see the behind the scenes dirty details of how it's doing the paginated testing. And the way that it's done here is it's not really a realistic scenario for real world automation. You'll see that I've chunked it out into an array. But it's static. So, for the purpose of showing an example of how this works fine, but in the real world, you're not really going to be working with static data. So in the past, what I've done is I create data models that will parse out the data that I'm gathering from some sort of data source, and chunk it out in the way that this is done. So say I have paginated tables that have 15 rows per page. I'll create logic that can set it to chunks of 15 rows, and then do my validation that way. And it's worked really well for me.
That's cool. And if you scroll up a little bit, because I think I saw some magic at the top. So there you've got your before each. So so that to me looks as though you're visiting the page, then you're doing a synchronization on, is there a cell rendered in the table?
Absolutely. Yes. So I do look for the cell to be visible. And the reason why is, Cypress moves pretty quickly, and it'll see that, down here, we're getting the table, and it says, all right, so I have a table element, but it'll throw a failure. So if I get rid of this guy, just to show you what would happen if we don't do that check first, and I'm going to only run this one test, if it should fail. Yes. So you'll see here, what it actually got was an empty array, because in that moment, your table was not loaded. So you need some kind of check there just to make sure that your table's loaded. And the easiest way to do that was just verifying that a cell was visible, any cell.
Yep, synchronization is the hardest bit of GUI automating, I find.
Yes.
But does Cypress have some synchronization built in? Does it do retries?
It does, yes. So typically it does retries. And what it will do is, it's a little bit different with the way that we're working with this, because like I said before, it did see a table. And what we're doing is we're getting a table. And if we look at the DOM at this moment, while it's loading, the table exists. So it won't do a retry. It'll say, all right, so I see the table, but the data that you're getting from it does not exist. So that is an automatic failure. But if in the test I was looking for a cell, it would retry up to, they have a default amount of time that it would retry that's configurable in Cypress. It would retry up until that point before it presents a failure.
So does that mean when you were doing your testing, you didn't have to do much synchronization, you just had to synchronize on the grid being ready, essentially?
Yeah, exactly. It's not 100% foolproof. There are times where it just, Cypress is moving very quickly, quicker than your application is, or maybe you're waiting for an element to be in a particular state before you do any kind of validation or interaction with it. So there are times when you do have to implement some kind of smart way to wait for your element to be in a particular state. But I would say largely Cypress takes care of that for you.
All right, cool. So what did you actually have to write in your abstraction there?
So if we want to look and see what we're doing in the actual AG Grid plugin. Oh, all right, here we go. So in our AG Grid source, we have our interactions first. And so the big one here is we are gathering the AG Grid data from the grid. And so what this is essentially doing is we feed it a selector, whatever our top level selector of the grid is. So this AG Grid element, and you'll see here, before we do, I'm going to find one where we're actually pulling the data. Here we go, get AG Grid data. So we're doing cy.get, which is essentially saying, hey, here's the element that I want you to get with the selector I'm providing you. And then yield that actual element from the DOM. And you'll see that we're feeding it my grid. And looking back over here, my grid, so the ID of my grid is a top level element for AG Grid. And the reason why that's important is because it takes that top level element, and then in our logic here to get the AG Grid data, we're then querying for header cells. And then we're also querying for all the actual cells in the rows. And then we're doing a mapping of what the headers are to the row cells. And that's what's providing us with the array of data that we're getting from the AG Grid.
Yep. So all these selectors that you're using, did you do that by reverse engineering from the DOM, or did you look at the theme and see what selectors AG Grid is using?
So yes, I looked at the DOM. I know that there are quite, a select few different themes that AG Grid has, and I worked with two before in the past. So I can't say with 100% confidence that this will work for every bit of the theming. I think that it's generic enough that it would work for whichever theme that you are actually utilizing with your AG Grid integration. But do not quote me on that. I can't.
Did you use the theme documentation to find the classes, or did you reverse engineer it in the DOM?
So yes, I looked at the DOM itself. I did an inspection in the DOM and looked to see how it was composed in there.
Right, because that's where this becomes hard,
Yes.
because you're automating a third-party component, and it's pretty much the selectors used in the theme probably won't change very much, but you may have picked some that might change in the future because we reserve the right to change things in the middle inside in order to make it look better or whatever. That's just one of the issues that you have when you're automating. Things can change, but that comes back to your earlier point of don't try and automate everything.
Exactly. We want to do as as limited automation against a third-party tool or plugin or whatever we have as possible. And you're absolutely right. That is a limitation, and it's a risk whenever we're doing this kind of automation because, as you said, that can change at any given time, and it might break what you're testing here. But luckily, that's why we have this as an open source, so anybody can go in there and update that at any given time, which you have experience with. You actually did.
That's the only thing that I was contributing to this. But that's good. So you've essentially got interactions and validations as the main parts of your abstraction layer.
Exactly. Yes. So we have, this is all the interactions that we have with the AG grid, gathering the data and doing any kind of manipulation. We have, our column header elements where we can do filtering on columns. We can sort the columns. So anything that you need to do to actually kind of interact with it, aside from anything that you have living within the cell. So, I mean, if you have links and checkboxes or buttons or whatever in the AG grid, this doesn't really cover that. This is more very generic. I want to sort a column. I want to filter by text. That's the high level of it, where I want to gather the data from the table itself.
Yep, because unless you're actually changing functionality in the grid, or some things are better off tested at a unit level. If you're writing your own cell renderer, you're better off testing that at a unit level. Whereas what you're trying to do is test it integrated within an application. There's buttons and drop downs outside the grid. They make things happen in the grid. So you want to make sure that the stuff that's rendered in AG grid is as you expect.
Exactly. That's exactly the point of this. Just making sure that the rendering is what I expect it to be. We found some interesting bugs when testing with this plugin. For instance, when we're doing sorting, we found that the sorting that we were applying to AG grid did not really render the way we expected it to within the grid. For example, it took into account capitalization. So if we had something within the grid that was not capitalized, it was pushed all the way to the very bottom of the results, which is not expected. And of course, we caught that failure very quickly. That is a test that we could do probably on the unit level as well, but it was not caught on the unit level. So this was one win for the Cypress test.
Cool. So what do the validations look like?
Sure. So in the validations, it's very straightforward. You'll see that what we're doing is we're just using, the chai assertions here, expecting the table to be empty, validating the exact order. So that's just making sure that if you're testing sorting, or if you need a very specific order, say you have like a hierarchy of data represented in AG grid, you want to make sure that that hierarchy is represented properly. And then it gets a little more interesting as you get down here. Validate table row subset is essentially, here's an array of data. I don't care what order it is. I just want to make sure that it exists. Or here's one piece of data I want to validate exists in the grid. And this one's the fun one. This is the one that we did the trial run of in the run over here, where you can actually click through and validate paginated data, which is notoriously fickle and a little bit scary to do when you're doing UI automation. But I wanted to find a way to do that in a way that was stable and easy.
Yep. But what you're also doing is you're creating high-level function names that abstract away all the data. So even though some of these assertions are quite simple, they're abstracted away to make it readable. So your tests now read well because of your abstraction there. Can we see where this is used inside the test?
Yeah, of course. Let's go ahead and check that out. So in the test that we were looking at here, let's make sure that I re-enabled that check. And here it is. What we're doing is we're getting that AG grid and then validating the paginated table data. And all we're doing is we're sending it this array of expected table.
So what's interesting there then is one of the things that I found when I was looking at your code is Cypress is working in a different way than I normally expect libraries to work, because you are hooking in your functions almost directly into Cypress as function names. Like, because that AG grid validate paginated table is not what your function is called. So you've got a mapping somewhere. Is that how Cypress normally works?
Yes. So, I mean, what you could do is this originally existed as just straight up JavaScript code. So I would call this function. It wasn't off of Cypress at all. And then I thought, you know, I'm using this directly with Cypress. It's kind of a one-to-one thing here. So I want to make it more intuitive for people that are testing with Cypress, especially within my organization. But then I thought, you know, on a larger scale, I think anybody working with AG Grid and doing Cypress validation and testing could find utility in this. And so what you can do with Cypress is you can do extensions of the commands. So you can override existing commands, or you can create new commands that are then chained off of this CY command here. And where that's done is if you go to support and you'll see commands aptly named, you know, here's where you would typically add it. But I went ahead and put it in the index. Ooh, so I have a higher level index here where we are actually syncing it to those commands. And you'll see that we're doing a Cypress commands add, get AG data. And this previous subject that we're passing in, this is just saying, okay, so this is going to be chained off of another Cypress command. And in our instance, it's going to be chained off of that get command that is getting the AG grid element.
Right, that's really cool. So one thing we haven't seen here that I noticed when I ran the test is it automatically created a video.
Yes, it did. If you run it from within here, it doesn't create the video. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that.
But that was like magic when I saw that, because that is that is quite a hard thing to achieve with other testing libraries.
It is, yeah, because you usually have to go ahead and configure that yourself to be able to gather the screenshots or any kind of video recording. And right out of the box, you won't see the browser open up because it will run headlessly. And we actually have a failure. I think I might have forgotten to update that test, but that's fine, because what we could do is we can look at our screenshots of the failure, or just click through.
So even though this was running headless, it created a video of the execution. So if this was running in the continuous integration server, we could go have a look at the video and see what happened.
Exactly, and that's exactly where a lot of the value comes in, because, you know, in CI, it's a little bit of a black box. You know, you can't just go into the machine and see what's going on. So what you want to see is the test running in real time. And when you're watching a playback of the video, you can uncover a lot of information that you may not be able to get otherwise from just standard logging or even just screenshots. I can't tell you how many times that's been of high value to me and incredible use, because something that runs perfectly on my desktop or your computer or anywhere else may actually have a lot of flakiness once you load it up into a CI pipeline. And being able to view that video playback is going to be able to enable you to see where that flake occurs and make your test that much more resilient against it.
Yep, and you've got this available through NPM now.
That's right.
Was this the first thing you tried to put on NPM? I've never put anything on NPM. I don't know how easy or hard that is.
This is actually the very first time I ever tried putting anything on NPM, and it was really easy. So it's just as simple as running a command to upload it into NPM. So if anybody wants to download this or add it as part of their application, it's just as simple as npm install Cypress AG grid. That's it. And then that will go ahead and download the package, the latest package that's available into your project.
And one of the cool things about Cypress is it's installing everything you need at this point. You don't have to go away and get a WebDriver. You don't have to go away and get a whole bunch of other libraries. Everything is there at that point, just ready to run.
Yeah, exactly. You know, in the past, one of the challenges that I face, and one of the ones that I want to overcome, is to be able to enable feature developers to contribute to the test automation and be excited about the test automation that we have in place. And it's typically been a barrier when they have a separate project that they have to go into, or they have to learn, you know, what Selenium is and how to load it up. And not that there's anything wrong with Selenium at all. I have such a soft spot for it, and I've worked with it for a number of years. But being able to have this live with your front end project, you know, utilize some of the code that the front end engineers, or even, you know, some back end engineers will be leveraging. It just makes it more intuitive for them to go in, know what the tests are doing, want to run it, and it enables them to get faster feedback on any changes or updates that they make to the code base themselves.
Right. That's really cool. So are you still working on this? You're using this in production?
Yes. So I am actually working on this as of today. I've been making some updates to it. So one thing to note is, as we discussed before, right now, this is just pulling back the data. So when I get that AG grid data back, it's just text. You know, it's an array of text with a header to cell mapping. But I changed it because, as we discussed, you know, AG grid is incredibly dynamic, and you could do so much with it, and keep whatever you want in those cells. You could have, you know, you can have text buttons, or excuse me, buttons, or checkboxes, or anything like that. So I wanted a way to be able to interact with those as well. So I'm looking at another iteration of this, where instead of just pulling back in the text values, I also want to pull back in the elements themselves, so that we can do any kind of interaction that's needed. So that'll be coming up next.
That's cool, but that's you're expanding this because you need that in your testing and your work. And if anyone else needs anything else, they can contribute into the project.
Absolutely, yes. And I've had a couple of people contribute already, and it's been very helpful because they've had use cases that weren't covered by what I needed to automate, but it was incredibly useful, and hopefully other people find it just as useful.
Cool. So is there anything else we should cover before we finish?
I don't believe so. I think that's about it. You know, you interact with the grid, you can validate the grid. Largely what you would need to do to test your implementation of AG grid is covered here. But if it's not, you know, let's talk. Let's see if we can get more functionality into this plugin.
Yep. So where can people find you if they want to hunt you down and ask you questions?
I am all over. You know, I'm on LinkedIn. People are welcome to connect with me. I have a blog. It's kerrymckeever.com, where it's not as active as I would hope for it to be, but it goes over some software automation, you know, tips and tricks that I've learned over the years, and just talking about software quality itself. I have a Twitter account that I just do not contribute to, but I'm on there, and then of course through GitHub or email. So you can connect to me through any of those means. Okay,
so I'll stick links to them wherever I put this video and write it up. So thank you for your time. Thanks for demonstrating this to us. Thanks for showing it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
I had to play with it. I was able to use it. That pretty much means anyone can use it. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much.